Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Olgun Akbulut. I'm a human rights and constitutional scholar based in Istanbul, Turkey. I'll be the moderator for today's webinar on artificial intelligence and human rights. This event is organized by the Human Rights Academy of the Frederick Naumann Foundation, Turkey. On behalf of the Academy, I would like to issue a warm welcome to all of you. Before focusing on our topic, just a short note to say that this event is being recorded and is going to be broadcasted on the social media channels of the foundation. Our topic today is artificial intelligence and human rights. At many parts of the world, there exists a collective societal fear from machines equipped with artificial intelligence. I'm sure you know about that. And some worry whether robots will rise up against human beings one day and create slavery again, or some worry simply whether artificial intelligence will take over their jobs. Are these just a fear of unknown, or there are good reasons for it? Is a question seeking an answer. So today we will talk about ethics, principles, human dignity, human rights, personal autonomy, and combination of all of these. So we have a lot to discuss within a limited time. I'm going to stop here and invite our distinguished speaker, Dr. Andras Hars. Andras is a professor of international law and human rights law. He's currently researching and teaching at the University of Public Service in Budapest. He's joining us from Budapest today. His area of interest extends from general issues of international and human rights law towards international criminal law, artificial intelligence, of course, international courts, military and peace operations, and killing of Jamal Khashoggi. He also has authored some pieces, scientific pieces on it. So a note about the program today. Andras will have around 40 minutes to present his initial thoughts. Then we look forward to continuing the discussion with the members of the audience. We are planning to complete the program in 80 minutes, roughly. Hello, Andras. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. And of course, a very special thank you to Professor Olgun Akbulut for inviting me to this event, in which we'll discuss the matters of artificial intelligence. Now, as you might have heard from the introduction, my main field of expertise is international law. So I'm approaching it from a slightly different angle than Professor Akbulut. This is more from a public international law standpoint, which I think might be refreshing to some of you. Now, one of the key elements that the professor has exposed in his introduction was the fear, was the uncertainty, was the sort of unnerving aspects of AI, because we're ultimately living in a world in which artificial intelligence is becoming the reality, but either we do not know what it is, or we have some fundamental misconceptions about the whole phenomenon, or we have heard some things which give an occasion to concern. And I joined the initiative of the international community's many actors that try to address these fundamental fears and in trying to alleviate or eliminate those fears that exist, that are deeply rooted in all of our collective psyche. So that's one of the goals which I would like to address with today's presentation. Now, if the slides are visible, and then I think let's get started, because time is, of course, ticking away. Is it? Yeah, it is clear. Thank you very much. First of all, we should address the fundamental issues of what artificial intelligence is. And of course, it is not an easy definition to give. Basically, we have as many definitions floating around concerning artificial intelligence as there are scholars who are applying those definitions. So I will not attempt to create one encompassing, one overarching definition. I just have a working definition myself, which I have deducted from the works of others. So I do not attempt to reinvent the whole sphere. I'm just using the most important elements that exist in the other definitions that are floating around. So in this context, we could identify AI, or artificial intelligence, as an independent entity which operates often without any physical physical manifestation and that operates independently or semi-independently from its maker. It also possesses some sort of knowledge and is able to utilize a letter in a manner not predetermined by its code, and is able to communicate with the outside world. Now, I do know that this is not a student-friendly definition by itself. However, if we were to dissect the various elements, I think it will become clear of what our expectation of artificial intelligence is. The first one is that it operates independently or semi-independently from its maker, and it is a very different entity to what we would perceive. And this is the first major distinction here, that it does not necessarily have a physical manifestation. It does not have a physical body. If you recall the science fiction movies of robots with red eyes moving towards you menacingly, this is something different. That's the physical manifestation, the body of the entity in which something could operate. But artificial intelligence is usually seen in devices. It's basically an algorithm that has developed, or it has a different working mechanism than a regular calculator. So it's a bit more difficult, a bit more different, a bit more dynamically developing a piece of equipment at this moment. And I think this is a precise expression. It does possess some sort of knowledge, so it will have the capacity to maintain and gather knowledge. Sometimes it is able to expand that knowledge, often by a very rapid degree, which is basically unheard of regarding humanity. And it can use that knowledge to solve things that are not exactly written for it. So it does not have an answer to anything, but due to certain mechanisms, like, for example, machine learning or deep learning or the so-called neural networks, it is going to be able to learn, not according to our standards and ideas, but it's able to develop itself, and it will be able to calculate possibilities and answers to questions that were not previously written for it. So this is what we call thinking on its own to a certain degree. And it can communicate its finding with the outside world. If you recall the famous scholar of the early 1940s, 1950s, Alan Turing, then the infamous Turing test was the one with which it could be decided whether the AI has reached the sufficient level of communication with the outside world, which could be measured by its fact to deceive the audience into thinking that they are communicating actually with a real human and not with an artificial intelligence. So these are the fundamental elements which define an AI, which will make up the most important characteristics that we're talking about. I do not wish to bore you with the various definitions. It will have these shared elements that will be presented and expressed in other way through the various findings of scholars of both international law, sometimes of human rights law, but usually with collaboration with computer scientists and computer engineers, because ultimately they will be the ones who can better define what the capabilities of these AI are, and then the lawyers will just quotation mark debate what those characteristics and conditions are to better compile them and to make an understanding that is digestible for the outside world. However, there are some other concepts that keep floating around here. Firstly, what we need to do differentiate from our regular understanding of AI, which can be found in, for example, chatbots even, and is quite prevalent in a lot of online systems, of what superintelligence or general AI is. And the general AI, or GAI, is going to be the stage of development for artificial intelligence in which the combined knowledge therein exceeds that of humanity, which will mean that there could be one combined singular entity which will possess more knowledge than humanity combined. Now, this is at this moment either in the future or in the realm of science fiction. So this is not something that exists right now, and there are expectations of when this was about to happen. Over the course of the last 10 years, there have been two such surveys, two such major findings, one in 2014 and one in 2018, in which several hundreds of experts and scholars were asked purely from the field of computer science, so those who are actually developing these systems, because they will have the most intimate knowledge there, when they expect this phenomenon to occur. And there was a major divide between scholars from Asia and a major divide between scholars from Europe and North America, which had a roughly similar idea, in which they said that it will happen somewhere between 28 and 76 years. Which will mean that from 2014 or 2018, we have roughly either around 20 years or 70 years. Why do we have such a huge range, such a huge difference? Well, because Asian scholars, predominantly Asian scholars, are a bit more optimistic on when we can reach it. They believe that it's somewhere closer to 28 years, whereas European and North American scholars are a bit more conservative. And they estimate that it will roughly take 76 years for this to happen, if it happens at all, because there is a strong estimate among scholars. Roughly 50% of them said that we will never reach the phase where the knowledge of AI will exceed that of humanity. So this is going to be something to go for the future. However, if this was to happen, then some scholars are quite pessimistic, not to the extent that the general population is pessimistic or is afraid of AI, with roughly 15% of them saying that it could have bad or a catastrophic outcome even for humanity. So the experts are somewhat divided. There is a great difference regarding their attitude of when this might happen. Why is it relevant for us? Is because if we reach this level where the overall knowledge of artificial intelligence will reach that of humans, some other regulation will be necessary than what we have today. Because ultimately, right now, we handle AI as objects, as things. According to, for example, Roman law, they do not have any special status. However, they might aspire to be having a special status in the future, should the general intelligence level is reached. And then there's, of course, the self-awareness level, in which it is presumed that we will not be able to handle that situation so well. So if the AI first reaches general intelligence levels and then self-awareness, which is purely right now, let me just add it once more, in the realm of science fiction. But if we ever to reach that phase, then it will most likely regulate us and not the other way around. So that's for the future, but it is something to look out for and to prepare for even now, even when we are estimatedly a few decades away from that happening. So how could it affect human lives? How is it possible for AI to have an effect on our lives? And is it good or bad? It will depend on our perspective right now. It is certainly true that AI has a profound effect on our lives, in our everyday lives even. We meet a lot of these systems, even though we are not aware that we're not always aware that these systems are actually using AI. So, for example, when you are buying tickets online, when you are engaging in any sort of flight purchase or tickets, basically for an airplane, you might have seen that the costs are changing day by day. Why? Because there is an algorithm which is calculating a lot of variables, and it is adopting prices to better fit the company's needs. Of course, not for the consumer's needs, but it is for the company's needs in a profit-oriented way. The same can be seen regarding Facebook and its bubbles, in which you are basically confined to your own ideas or to ideas similar to you on social media, and it's going to be very hard to burst that bubble and to reach opposing ideas, because that gets filtered out. Originally for the advertisers to have a more distinguishable target audience, but now it is also having political ramifications as well. The same can be said for the search engines, Google or any other search engine. It will remember what you have searched, and it will develop advertisements based on previous searches in a quite adaptable way. So if you haven't searched for something in a few weeks, then that gets thrown out, and the system is basically developing based on your current search patterns, which might seem quite trivial or might seem quite frightening depending on your approach to AI. And then we have yes.
Andras, we are still seeing your first slide. Is that okay?
Oh no, it should not. I'm having pictures right now, so that's not exactly ideal.
It's your opening slide.
Yes, I think I will stop sharing and then restart it, because I think on my screen it was working quite properly. So let's check.
Let's try.
Which slide?
Now we see the pictures.
And if I change, does it change?
Works well.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
okay. Somehow it was struck.
Let's continue from here.
Maybe it's the work of the AI trying to stop us from analyzing it in detail. Thank you for notifying me.
Okay.
It does have very seemingly harmless applications as well. For example, regarding agriculture, in which it is entirely possible for an AI to plan for harvest. So not just the robotics technology, in which, as it is shown in the picture, it gets picked up, but by planning, by accommodating weather patterns, for example, by selecting crops that can stand the challenges of the changing environment. This is all in the realm of AI. However, it is used extensively right now in modern agriculture methods. Or the automated decision processes. In a lot of countries, it is a working pattern that for low ranked or low tiered administrative cases, which do not really require any decision making by a human, it is delegated to be done by automatic functions. So for example, if you are just looking for a certificate, or if you're looking for a paper by the government stating, for example, where you live, or the application of a personal identity card or driving license, creating that, printing that is going to be automated in a lot of countries still. Whereas for other functions, for example, visa applications, that is still going to be handled by an individual, because there are lots of factors to consider, and right now it is not automated yet. However, where it is also quite prevalent, and we have very remarkable achievements there, is medicine, in which, for example, as you can see in the bottom right picture, the diagnostics world is using artificial intelligence to a quite large degree in comparing either X-ray scans or other matters of diagnostics in finding out, for example, tumors, in trying to decide whether what we see on the picture is actually a tumor, a malignant growth, or something else. So we have lots of applications that are seemingly getting into our lives. In most of these pictures, you can either not see anything because it's incorporated into the system, like for example, with regards to self-driving cars, or it is depicted as a robot, so that the ordinary observer can better understand what is going on. In a lot of ways, a robot is operating in a completely robotic fashion without any AI being incorporated into the physical body of a robot, and AI systems are basically invisible, that are seemingly streamlined into our current equipments. However, this session is about human rights violations and possible concerns regarding human rights, and we have several issues with that. Regarding self-driving cars, for instance, self-driving cars threatening human life by making decisions or trying to make decisions similarly to what a human would do, could be very problematic. For example, in choosing in an obviously impossible scenario who to hit with a car. Do we hit the pregnant woman going? Do we hit the elderly couple? Do we sacrifice more people to save even more people? These dilemmas, these ethical dilemmas that we are having, are right now seemingly impossible for AI, and that is one of the reasons why several countries are reluctant to use them. But we could think about criminal law, for example, profiling techniques, or drawing statistics, drawing conclusions from the database of criminals, which can have very detrimental effects because they cannot analyze complicated socioeconomic conditions that a human researcher would be capable of doing. In a much more physical manifestation, chatbots, for example, as we can see in the upper right corner, that are learning from our own patterns on social media, are either turning out to be misogynistic, outright racist, or showing a very almost caricatured way of humanity and our understanding of past events. Several chatbots in the past had to be taken down because the way they have tweeted, sorry, the way they have been using social media platforms was outright racist, outright discriminatory in nature, because this is what the AI has picked up from our own conversations. And last but not least, the decision-making process. If it is used in public governance, for example, then the AI right now cannot solve issues of either discrimination or access to justice, for example, or our modern concepts, or our basically hypothetical concepts of, for example, the presumption of innocence. That is why it is currently not used in the justice system for criminal cases, for deciding on criminal cases, but their recommendations and their analysis and evaluation is then used by judges who will then make the decisions. On a very bottom level, it can be established that AI systems will be either looked very favorably upon if it expedites, if it swiftens the process that is used in public governance, or it can be looked upon with a lot of distrust when it is actually the one making the decisions and taking the role of a human to decide in a lot of cases. So we have a lot of mistrust, we have a lot of places where human rights violations could occur. So let's see how states and other actors are handling these situations. From the state level, we can say that there are roughly 200 policies on AI development, a lot of them which are touching on human rights issues, but they are remaining on the level of principles and purely principles. On the level of international organizations, we have several candidates which are advocating for a more robust international regulatory framework. There is basically a race among international organizations of who will be the one who will be able to get states together and push states very softly towards coming up with a compromise. On the universal level, we have UNESCO, we have the OECD, and in the European level, we have the Council of Europe and the European Union, which do have very robust initiatives by which they are trying to make sure that states are behaving in a certain way towards AI. Almost all of them is going to be either a regulatory framework, a cooperative framework, or a sort of a setting of the premises, setting of fundamental ideas and norms which states can then follow up and which can orient companies, for example, in decision making. And then, of course, we have tons of NGOs, advocacy groups, which are helping the process by giving expert opinions, which are trying to push states and push international organizations towards a certain conduct. It is usually defined by the NGO's own goals, or it is defined by the common good or the perceived common good towards which they are working toward. On the international level, I know this chart seems to be quite scary at first glance. However, we can see that the three entities which would propose regulation right now, chief among them the EU, UNESCO, and the OECD, are having either recommendations in nature, or in the case of the EU, are moving towards a stricter regulation, which would demand implementation from its member states. So it would be in effect in a lot of areas in Europe, and similarly to the GDPR regarding data protection, it could be looked upon as an example for other regional systems and for other states to voluntarily follow if it becomes a noteworthy example. The attitude towards human rights, that's what I would like to highlight here. For the European Union, of course, it has to be done according to the values of the EU, pushing on fundamental rights and principles without listing, of course, what those fundamental rights and principles are. So it's not giving us a full list of human rights which we could protect. It just says that the existing frameworks will have to be respected for any future AI regulation. It is quite novel in the way it is comprising or distinguishing between various risk systems. For example, high-risk system or so-called high-risk systems, which can threaten the social cohesion and the social fabric, are outright heavily discouraged or even banned in the EU. However, one of the main criticisms towards this system is that it essentially creates a very rigid environment in which something is attempted to be regulated, which does not exist or which only partially exists. So the EU is, on the one hand, leading the whole process, on the other hand, is producing such an act, such an outcome document, which could be heavily criticized. It is not yet in effect. It is not yet binding on EU member states, but we are getting there. In 1 or 2 years, it is very likely that it is going to be implemented on an EU-wide level. The whole goal for the EU and for a lot of these organizations is building trust and confidence. Which will mean that for the general population, averting fears, averting the general issues which stop the human population or the general citizenry from accepting AI-based technologies. That is what they are trying to address by promoting transparency, by promoting a human rights-friendly environment, and by promoting accountability for those violations. However, right now that is not exactly not exactly secured. We have strong objective responsibility regimes right now in place in a lot of countries which are supporting this notion, like, for example, in the United Kingdom. So what is the uniqueness aspect? Why is it really interesting? Well, for the EU, it is a very strongly worded legal document, a very comprehensive regime that it would like to create. For the UNESCO, for example, it's a very different organization. It tries to encompass a lot of states, and it attempts to make sure that states collaborate on those fundamental ideas. It is supporting both the youth, its use for international humanitarian law to a certain degree, to make sure that in armed conflicts, regarding not just the protection of cultural heritage, but regarding the protection of humanity, it is used, and also in international human rights law. It is working on the UN's human rights mechanisms to make sure that the principle of human rights, and it lists human dignity and the freedom from harm and subjugation as the core elements, it is being created. It's not a legal norm, strictly speaking, it's a recommendation that has ethics and principles in its core. And then for the OECD, it is one of the earliest regulators in this process, with a council established on the issue, and guidelines that were implemented in 2021, so just last year. It is emphasizing a trustworthy and responsible AI that respects human rights and democratic values. We have no idea how this respect of human rights and these democratic values are going to look like, whether it's encoded into their systems, whether it's just there to assuage and to settle down fears in the general population. We have no idea. But this is what they have been coming up with. On a more personal note, I am somewhat uneasy about these empty phrases like respecting human rights, because we all know that that if a general convention on human rights is just promoting it and making sure that respect is there, then it's not really something that can be enforced, something that can be executed, something that can be carried out by the states. So it will most likely lack enforcement mechanisms, which is one of the key weaknesses of international law in general. So we are trying to make sure that the collective societal fear is removed, it is assuaged, that we are putting in place some primary safeguards, some basic principles, so that we can comfort the population. These players on the international level are targeting states first and foremost. They're making sure that states are cooperating, but they're also trying to influence other international organizations as well. I've mentioned this race to develop and to regulate. Basically, if you are having a more international organizations friendly attitude, then you can say that they would like to guide humanity for the purpose of cooperation and harmony. If you are a bit more pessimistic, then you could say that these organizations are trying to prove their own relevance in the 21st century by targeting matters such as artificial intelligence. The truth is most likely somewhere in the middle. And one of the key races, or one of the key decisions that states will have to make is whether they would support the development or support the regulation. Because for most companies, and more specifically companies in the United States and in China, they will say that we are having as little regulation as possible so that the companies that are developing AI-based technologies can have a free rein, and that competitiveness can soar, it can rise, and it can have a positive influence on how our own economies develop. In contrast, the European Union is regulating first and asking questions later. So they are first and foremost trying to regulate these matters, and then it is trying to still incorporate some leeway, some sort of free space in which development can continue. Whether it's going to be as restrictive as some countries fear is to be seen. And let's just not forget, as a last thing to recall here, is that these organizations are going to have very different capacities to regulate. On the universal level, where we have the OECD and UNESCO, they're not having the capacity to engage in a binding resolution, so they will not be having the capacity to strongly regulate. The European Union does have this capacity, and right now, just this September in 2022, the Council of Europe has begun its own discussions on a proposed artificial intelligence treaty. So that could be one of the first binding treaties from a purely human rights perspective that is to be introduced for the wider European region, which is very hopeful, but I think it's 1 or 2 years ahead in the future. So if we were to transport the fundamental knowledge and our current system of human rights to the realm of AI, so as to affect states, affect developers, and for it to be used in practice, we see a lot of questions, and these questions cannot be answered easily. The first question here is, what should we transfer? Because we have hundreds of human rights treaties in the world. Some of them contain binding norms, like the prohibition of torture, the prohibition of slavery. Do we implement all of them, and how are they to be mirrored? How are they to be transformed into the field of human rights? So should we just instantly digitalize everything and trying to create an algorithm that is capable of human rights? It would be a very large enterprise, and we have certain doubts, at least with the data scientists that I have talked to, that it is actually possible. So we do not know if it is actually going to be transferable. The second issue that we're having is human rights are basically results of a political compromise. So an abstract political statement like respecting human rights will have a drastically different meaning in a European context, and in, for example, and in the Middle East, and in Africa, and in Latin America, and in certain in parts of Asia. So how do we make sure that the general norms that we are applying for these human rights treaties, which were necessary, by the way, because a political compromise had to be established there, can be translated into the world of AI, because that world needs certainty. It cannot have abstract concepts. It can operate on very small, tiny, minute details on which it can operate, basically to reduce it to zeros and ones so it can make a decision in a moment's notice. Thirdly, human rights systems are very complex by nature. We not only have just treaties, but we have customary international law, we have peremptory norms of international law, we can have judicial decisions which can support a current understanding of human rights, which merit their own studies, as there are hundreds and thousands of studies analyzing, for example, how the European Court of Human Rights is functioning right now. Mirroring that to the realm of AI is very problematic, because we can have a hierarchy in international law and generally in a norm hierarchy, but translating the aids or the materials that aid in ascertaining human rights regarding artificial intelligence can be very problematic. Thirdly, we have certain regional specifics. We have the Council of Europe system, of course, in Europe, but we have the African Union system, we have the Organization of American States, and we have several areas like the vastness of Asia, which do not have such a solidified human rights regime. How would that exist? Would it be possible to have regional human rights regime which would operate on a specific basis, and then for the rest we just have the universal level? It's quite unclear. Of course, I'm just raising these questions, and then I will attempt to answer them, which I would encourage you to debate, because these are just my ideas and notions on the difficulties and on how to tackle them. And then, of course, the fifth one is, I think, the most problematic. Human rights is not something that is fixed, that is certain, that is unchangeable. Our understanding of human rights has changed substantially. Let's say 150 years ago, slavery, for example, was still widespread. The women's suffrage, for example, is a novelty of the 20th century. So our human rights understanding basically developed over the course of the last 70 or 80 years. And this evolution did not stop. If we believe that it has stopped, then it's an ultimately false presumption. Think about, for example, abortion rights in the US. For 50 years, it was certain that abortion rights are now final, that this is something that is protected by the Supreme Court of the United States. But still, due to another understanding of the very same Supreme Court, it is now called into question. So society is not exactly finished with discussing what human rights are, and the development, I think, is constant, which is making coding very, very problematic. So how should we answer them before we become depressed by the seemingly insurmountable threats and odds? Well, the reason for it, and I just skip it to the end because it is going to be very. I wanted to tackle a lot of the other issues, but we will not have time for everything. So we will move it to the questions and answers session. But to give some of the answers to these pertaining issues on what to transfer, for instance, we can start small. We can select one or two treaties which can then be transferred to the realm of AI, seeing whether some sort of learning algorithms can be used to predict human rights violations in the future. This is a research that is going to be hopefully launched in the next 1 or 2 years by our university. So we're going to be cooperating with some local actors and some data scientists and computer scientists who can help us in this endeavor to have a model system which can have a predictive aspect. And then what to transfer? If we can catalog, if we can discuss what human rights mean, if we can have a basic understanding of our notions of human rights, then it can be possible. Right now, there's a movement, basically a European research group in Slovenia, which is attempting to have this very same moment for the right to life. So it's one very specific human right. And then the complexity of the regimes that exist for the primary norms. I think here we could also start small. We could just use several international treaties and then find out what we mean by customary international law. If I had to predict something at this moment, is that customary international law, I don't think is something that can be made available in terms of AI. So there will be room for lawyers and those interested in international law and constitutional law for human rights, because the entirety of the current system is so complicated that by itself, it is very hard to imagine that it can be translated. So for some norms, it could be possible. For others, I do not think it's the case. I think the situation would be much easier regarding the regional elements here. So for the European, for the African, and for the American system, we could create regional sub-norms or subsets of norms which would operate on a lex specialis basis compared to the universal understanding of human rights. However, for the fifth question, I'm also somewhat pessimistic. I would say that these notions should not be coded. I would say that society will have to keep the reins in their own hands regarding the development of human rights norms, and that artificial intelligence should follow these norms, but not be the ones directing human growth and development on a societal scale. So we should have our own understanding of these phenomena, and then that should be transferred, but not the other way around. And I think our time is running out very rapidly, so I would just, yeah, a few minutes still.
Yeah, you have 5 more minutes, but we are again stuck in one slide, the challenges slide.
Yes, that's right.
Okay?
Right. Yes. So, and now it has moved again with you. Yeah. So the possible subject status, I would summarize it very briefly. This has been addressed by some international organizations. Right now, international law does not regulate artificial intelligence. It is not deemed to be a desirable regulation. Now, this can change when we reach certain levels of development, but right now, states and the international community itself believe that it is right now not worth regulating. There is no consensus, even on, among states, on what the role of AI should be. And on the universal level, this is somewhat utopistic. We have some ideas on how and when it should be regulated. If you're interested about this topic, then I can get back to it later on. But right now, this is something for the future. We have some wonderful examples for it, where certain inanimate aspects, for example, can be regulated. We can regulate it as a legal person, as what we do for commercial ventures. But right now, states are just experimenting with these notions and are not set to a certain way on which regulation can be done. And as a last thought-provoking notion for you, the attitude is going to be very much called into question in the future, because states right now are trying to find out what the general population, what the overall population is feeling about AI. So whether we should limit its applications to certain norm, that some topics are completely off limit. We can say that, for example, regarding healthcare, regarding, let's say, family matters or the criminal process, we shouldn't use AI because that should be reserved for humans. However, for let's say, transportation, having the best GPS route that is constantly updating itself, that's a major benefit that we do not want to part with. Or, for example, tracking the reasons of our hostility towards AI. What do we fear? Do we just have notions from science fiction, or we actually fear losing control? We are afraid that our whole society would be extinct if AI would be a prevalent system, or we fear that we would lose our jobs and we will not be able to retrain ourselves to be employed in different jobs. Or what would satisfy the average citizen? What sort of protection in their life? Should we have the ultimate control of having the big red button to turn it off at a moment's notice if something goes wrong? Should we have sanctions regimes in place? Do we have police officers specifically for that? Should we hard code certain principles? Like if you are a science fiction fan and you have read Asimov and the 3 rules of robotics, should we have something like that for AI, or should we have some human control in which the AI would render the decisions in the first case? But if the human does not agree with the outcome, then there should be some sort of human supervision all the time, where the higher authority should be a human, and they could then override or change the decision that has been rendered by the AI. These are open questions. Some states are doing these surveys right now to find out about the attitudes of the individuals living in their countries, but it's not a clear-cut case, and states are moving towards very different directions. Not as different as it may seem. This is a study from the Berkman Klein Research Center in recent years, and it shows that a lot of state regulation, a lot of international regulation is still having the same keywords, having the same buzzwords in it, of transparency, of making sure that, that this is an accountable system. So I believe there is room for cooperation for states, because we ultimately want the same thing. Our methods may differ, but a consensus might not be far off, because AI technologies are very much akin in a lot of these countries, and we're facing the same challenges, essentially. As concluding remarks, I would just say that we would have to have, of course, political will. So these challenges are not insurmountable. We do not have fundamental cultural differences, for example, because artificial intelligence is, I think, something that supersedes cultures. I have been a guest lecturer in several countries now, but in all of these countries, students, for example, are using smartphones with a lot of AI-based technologies on them, irrespective of whether that country is India, whether it is Turkey, whether it is Spain or the Netherlands. So we have the same challenges lying ahead of us. However, let's not forget that we have to have the core decision-making maintained by ourselves and not given to the AI, because we can get stuck in our little social media bubble. We can be heavily influenced by what we see online, and that is a very rapidly closing bubble around us. And for that to work, we have to have a diversity of forums. And I think it is actually beneficial of how these international organizations are competing, because competition, I think, is ultimately a healthy thing. So if we have multiple approaches, then that can help in development, and they can affect one another's own processes of development, which can lead to a more consumer-friendly and a more, let's say, rational consensus at the end. However, for that, the regulatory attitude that is very persistent in law will have to change, because for all legal subjects, we are following social tendencies and then trying to regulate it a few years behind or a few decades behind. However, for this to work, we would have to be somewhat proactive. And this is what the Council of Europe, the European Union, and the United Nations are also promoting, a somewhat different attitude right now. And as the UN's own Human Rights Commission, or let's say almost former Human Rights Commissioner Michelle Bachelet of Chile has said, we cannot really wait on this regulation. Now is the time to make sure that human rights are protected in this era of artificial intelligence. Now is the time for states to step up and to regulate. And I think with that, I have expanded my time frame. So thank you very much. And I would encourage you to ask as many questions as possible. I'm open to debate. Feel free to contradict me. I do not claim that my ideas are essentially all of them correct, or most of them correct. Feel free to voice your opinions and concerns as you will. For racial profiling, and I think this is generally tied to not just to the criminal system, but the so-called social scoring system, which is something to be dreaded, and that is allegedly either being constructed or used in some limited effect in China, for instance. That is something which the European Union has listed as a high-risk system. So they are saying that this should outright be banned, outright shouldn't exist, because this creates a disparity, and it is ultimately breaching human rights to a very severe degree in the European Union. So EU member states, for EU member states, it is right now recommended, but it is most likely going to be binding later on, not to use these systems. And I completely agree with this evaluation. So social scoring, predicting patterns, and then trying to trying to have decisions based on predictive systems, I think it is very troubling and should not be used in its entirety. As a thought experiment, even, I think this is something that it contradicts our understanding of human rights. It contradicts our understanding of, for example, the presumption of innocence and the right to fair trial. So there are lots of concerns here which come into play. Long story short, I would not recommend it, and I would not support it. Ultimately, this is a huge debate. who should be responsible. Right now, what we see, and this is what I have alluded to regarding the UK, that's where we have the insurance systems. Not very well versed in private law, but this is what I have heard from my colleagues, that we have the objective insurances. So that they have to pay an incredibly large amount of money to the insurance companies when they're trying to insure self-driving vehicles, because ultimately that would put every ounce of responsibility on the actor that is ultimately responsible for the insurance itself. So the driver, as they are not driving themselves, would of course be exempt from responsibility. However, it is an open question whether they should do regular maintenance. What happens if the program was working very well, if the algorithm was working fine, but there was no regular maintenance? Whether the car mechanic, who are right now basically electronic experts at the same time, not just regular car mechanics with who are getting or taking the car apart, have done something that would change or compromise the integrity of the system. These are open questions, and we have, so I do not claim to know everything on the subject. I know a very, very small detail. We have research groups that are sponsored by a lot of these companies, which are trying to create regimes for these companies under which they could operate. So this is not a clear discussion with a clear end in sight. Right now, we do not know what is going to happen, or whether self-driving cars will be allowed in all countries in the world. Right now, we have test runs. We have the learning curve of these countries, because they even have very different traffic rules. So, for example, if following your example, the car was manufactured in China, then they would have to teach that system to have a driving in the UK, in which different traffic rules apply, different ways to drive, and the, for example, continental Europe and other rules in other countries. So could it recognize, for example, the traffic lights, or do we have the same type of traffic lights in all countries? Do we have to drive on the same way of the road? So these are very much open questions which are still haven't been answered to the fullest, and I do not claim to know the answer to this one. Unfortunately, it's a work in progress. Yes, I think racial bias, and there have been some studies on this field, racial bias does exist, because if we are sticking with the criminal justice system, and if the AI is just taking a look at, for example, let's stick with the example of the US, because this is quite contrasted there. If you see that how many of the prison population is of a different color than white, then you will see that overall, a much larger percentage of colored people will be in prison in the US. The logical remark there would be that, well, most likely these people are prone to committing crimes, so the crime rate should be higher in these spheres, in these sectors, so we should do something about it. But that does not take into context either the racial structures that exist in those countries, the previously existing societal norms, or the conditions in which most of these people live. So it can be a very distorted reality, and that is why we cannot just rely on AI when it comes to profiling, when it comes to the whole system of criminal justice, because that would be a vastly unfair system. The same thing with for example, the labor market and the wages of men and women. Right now, if we are completely honest, there is a difference between how men and women are getting paid. So the AI could deduct from it in a completely rational way that women are earning less and they should earn less because this is what society wants. However, if we take a look at the media attention, for example, that is surrounding the issue, then it's very much something to strive against. We are striving towards, for example, parity regarding wages, because why should someone get more money or less money just because of their gender? So these are not things that the AI can calculate. On the one hand, because there is still an ongoing debate about these issues, and secondly, because they cannot have the broad concepts that we are able to encompass in a discussion such as this. They are very adept at using statistics. They're counting way faster than any human on Earth, and they can now operate based on a lot of data sets. And this is the novelty here, that certain data sets can be combined in sort of a modular way in which they can be, let's say, having different results by combining various data sets. And that's a very novel phenomenon, but it still does not substitute our human understanding of the deeper societal aspects, which I think right now cannot be neglected. When we have general AI, then perhaps, but for a few more decades, I think the human aspect should not be negated.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, my understanding from the next question is it's about proportionality and the balancing test. So the question is putting right to privacy on the one hand, that's the individual interest, and the data needed for the AI to work. Maybe that's the public interest. So how are we going to balance these two?
I think it largely depends on what kind of data sets you are using and on whether consent has been given by the user to use our own data. For a lot of these data sets, having a general knowledge on how long this data can be used could be sufficient. For example, the issue of public spaces and cameras comes into mind. We do not really provide our consent or a specific consent that when we are frequenting public places, like for example train stations, we get our faces scanned and monitored and the data to be collected. However, it's implicit. By visiting these places, we know that these are there for the safety, for the reasons of public safety, and we generally expect it to be deleted after 1 week, 1 month, or a year, depending on how long the actual data is stored. However, this is not a long-term solution. We have this system because it works right now. We have experimental systems which are even more problematic. So, for example, Portuguese colleagues are now working on a system which could recognize, for example, what kind of problem you have from a medical standpoint just by analyzing the face. So whether you are just angry, just tired, or are having serious internal issues could be monitored by an artificial intelligence technology. Does it have consent? If you are going to the hospital and you are requiring medical attention, you would basically give your consent to anything just to be cured. So here the consent is implicit, but is it really voluntary, or is it somewhat coerced, or do we feel that it is necessary for the system to work? Very much debated. So these are very good questions. I wish I knew the answer, but since I feel for most of them, there is no societal consensus. We can just have a few things said about pros and cons, and then we shall wait for the regulator or for society to voice what they think about it. These organizations, specifically OECD and UNESCO, they are building on the premise that states who have sponsored these agreements have done so voluntarily. And if they have agreed to these notions voluntarily, then they would implement it because they feel that it is in their interest to implement. So the fundamental notion is that the general rule or the international cooperation basically would serve as a template for states to work on. And when states are either creating or updating their national AI policies, then those policies will be influenced by either what the OECD has done or what UNESCO has been doing. And indeed, we are seeing several national AI policies on the domestic level, which have either direct references to international norms or are using the same terminology. So it does have a direct effect, although as as with a lot of soft law materials, it is having a mild effect or a long-term effect. It is trying to shape the discussion. It is using very subtle ways on which state practice can be influenced. And then that practice can work towards a more unified approach on the international level. So the effect can be somewhat circular in that regard. But yes, you're quite right. Right now, it is only the EU which will be able to have a binding norm on these states. And later on, hopefully, when there's a new international agreement on the Council of Europe's level, then that is going to be something which will also be binding on states which are joining, because joining these treaties is ultimately always going to be voluntary for the states. But if they join these treaties later on, especially on the Council of Europe level, then they will have to implement it on their national level as well.
Correctly.
Yes, there is a palpable discontent among artists who are using AI-based technologies, because right now the ultimate owner is going to be the one who has manufactured the AI technology itself. So if you are using a program, then you're not going to be the owner, even though you're putting your own input and your own, let's say, ways of artistic self-expression into those systems. But of course, that doesn't really fit today's standards, and it doesn't really fit the desires of these artists who are using those systems. So either they will boycott those systems, or, and that is a bit more likely in my opinion, they will push the regulators towards having a more intellectual property friendly approach. Because if they are putting something in those systems, then either you can have, or at least you should have, a shared ownership of the rights, because the one that has created the AI technology is going to be somewhat also, let's say, owning that part, because it's a bit more difficult than for example, creating just a canvas, because right now we do not say that the one who has made the canvas for the painting does have ownership. It's always the painter. But for AI, it is going to be the one who has created the algorithm by which it operates. So it is somewhat contradictory to our previous understanding of intellectual property rights. But right now there is some movement in changing those rules and in persuading governments to be more, let's say, intellectual property friendly towards artists. That's the short answer. So when we're talking about human rights, we often forget that states are not exactly in all countries very human rights friendly, and their attitude and their actual practice regarding human rights is going to be vastly different, which can also mean that there is going to be a discrepancy from the political level all the way to the practical level on the ground, because there is no state that would say that I would be violating human rights at every turn, at every possible way. But in reality, either they're not preparing their own officials to maintain human rights, or are communicating something else than what they practice. So this major discrepancy, this major paradox would have to be resolved somewhat. So how do we expect states to use AI to promote human rights when they wouldn't be able to do so based on archaic technologies of newspapers and of regular media? And to this, I would say that I think it can be a valuable tool. So if we would have AI systems which would be able to predict where human rights violations could occur, and which could have, roughly speaking, a translation of human rights obligations that would be comparable to that of humans and to that of artificial intelligence, then that could be one of the ways in which AI can be used to be a bit euphemistic, to the betterment of humanity and to the betterment of humankind. But right now we're not seeing this. So right now we see the fear, we see the negative side of how AI is being regarded as a tool of oppression, as something that would create an oppressive social regime that would hamper human rights. But I would argue, and yes, it might be because I'm somewhat optimistic on the matter, that it could be used otherwise. And for that, we would need to use either a predictive system, or we would have to have implementation of human rights in very specific treaties. That's why I'm quite optimistic about both the EU's attempts and on the Council of Europe's attempts, because these will be the organizations which will have the capacity to show us how it is being done, how it can be done in the future, if they decide that they want to regulate it decently. Because putting it there that human rights would have to be protected and respected just as a general slogan will not protect human rights, because it will not have a court mechanism, it will not have an enforcement mechanism. So we need to know how it can operate in the future for the betterment. We need to have some systems in a place which will either predict, either monitor, or it can regulate violations of human rights. And technology does have a wonderful possibility in that field, because if we see, for example, public protests on the ground where people are protesting, and there is a police officer, for example, that is abusing their power and, for example, beating up protesters, violating their rights to protest, their rights to be heard, their freedom of expression, basically, then that gets immediately recorded by someone's phone. So it is quite unheard of that there will be no one with a phone who will be monitoring these events. So that's also technology, that's also one way in which technology can help us with human rights abuses. But it does have a human factor involved. Someone will need to initiate that recording. The same applies to AI. Someone will have to develop that system, and then people will have to use that system in order for that to be an effective tool. How that's going to be developed, I think that will be developed in the next 5 to 10 years. So right now we are at a quite historic moment. We're in the doorstep of artificial intelligence being used. Whether it will be used for the betterment of humanity or whether it will be used as an oppressive monitoring system, it will be decided very shortly.
Well, thank you so much. I think we reached a very good point, so we can stop here if you like. So thank you for this very fruitful conversation, and thank you for your being with us this evening, Andras. Before thanking to other members of the foundation, would you like to add something on top of everything? As a last word?
Thank you very much. It was really my pleasure to be here. I was very much not just surprised, but surprised in a positive way of the quality of the questions that I have received. It really kept me on my toes because they have encompassed everything from criminal law to private law all the way to data protection standards, most of which I'm not exactly familiar with, since I come from the domain of public law. But it is quite clear that if we are to regulate AI on the international level, we need to be aware of all these elements, because it will have data protection implications, it will have implications in intellectual property, it will have public safety ramifications. So if we are to regulate, then we have to take into consideration all of these factors. And this is why some of the regulators have been so cautious, because regulating something on the level of principles is very easy. We can all agree that we need transparency. We can all agree that human rights will have to be respected and promoted. But when we delve deeper and try to decide what that actually means in practice, then the state's opinions are going to diverge. And if we can get behind a little bit, then that would be a huge step forward. But for that, we need to have a common understanding of human rights, which is, I think, somewhat lacking. So that's why we would need to have an understanding first of human rights, like, for example, basic concepts like the right to life, regarding the death penalty, regarding abortion, for instance, are highly debated. So if we were to comb it out and to have a more general understanding of human rights and some social consensus, then we could regulate. So the important thing is to keep the debate alive, to have critical thinking, not just to be in our own thought bubbles, but think outside of the system and try to be looking at the optimistic aspects as well. Those were 3 thoughts, actually, not just one, but thank you. I will try to be very brief.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for your terrific remarks. And I would also like to thank the FNF people, the Human Rights Academic Program Coordinator, Elif Güney Menderes, and her assistants, Yiğit and Vatikan, working behind the scene. And thank you to the audience for being with us this evening. We would like to see you again for the future events. So stay in touch and have a good evening.